Welcome to the Port Hope Historic Barn Quilt Trail. Please join us as we walk you through each of the 23 barns and their beautiful quilt boards. Remember, if you decide to do the tour on your own, please do not enter the private properties. All quilts can be viewed from the roadside. The Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, also known as the ACO, Port Hope branch, celebrated Canada's 150th anniversary by honoring the history of the Port Hope barns. The Barn Quilt Project is a scenic trail of 23 heritage barns throughout urban and rural Port Hope. Many of our valued barns have been chosen not only for their architectural significance, but also for their ongoing economic contribution to the community. Each barn has its own identity. The unique history, ongoing story, and continuing cultural contribution is beautifully narrated by hand-painted board tiles with traditional quilt borders. The quilt tile boards highlight the narrative of the farm, its function, and its people. The visual depiction of the barn resulted from a collaboration between the artist and the barn owners. Square tiles, some as large as 8 feet by 8 feet, are prominently displayed on each barn, giving a contemporary salute to our local history and our commemorative 150th Canada celebration. Of unknown age, this barn was purchased by an ancestor who used the barn for a stable. The image of a pretty pony brings memories of going about town in a handsome leather-trimmed carriage of the late 1800s. This is a small Dutch barn. Dutch barn. A basic rectangular form on flat ground with a ground floor entered from the short gable end and a hayloft on the second floor above. This is a derivative of one of the earliest forms of barn, which long ago were house barns with the dwelling at one end and the barn at the other. Depicted in the corners of the quilt board are the original lightning rods still installed on the early 1900s barn, which once stored apples and tomatoes previously grown on the land. At one time, the barn housed leghorn chickens on all 3 floors. Puss in the Corner quilt pattern also relates to the present owner's fondness for cats. This is an English barn. English barn. A basic rectangular form entered at grade from the long side with a hayloft at the second loft floor above. The ground floor is often, but not always, of heavy stone walls and the upper floor in timber framing. Generally, the roof has a single pitch at a modest angle with a single ridge. This property was purchased by Elias Smith in 1799, one of the founders of Port Hope. Over the years, the 200-acre parcel was divided into lots of 25, 115, and 60 acres to various families up until 1958. The quilt board represents the Dutch heritage of the present owners and the grain corn that is grown on the land and the turf farm of the past. The quilt pattern is the Dutchman's puzzle. This is also an English barn. William Harris, a United Empire Loyalist, arrived in Port Hope from New York in 1793 in what was then Smith's Creek at the mouth of the Ganaraska River. Sometime after his arrival, he purchased a log cabin from a well-known fur trader. The quilt board shows the Loyalist flag surrounded by the log cabin pattern, but also reminds us of the travel over land and water to get to a new country. This is a bank barn style. Bank barns. These barns have a long tradition of using sloping terrain with or without a ramp to allow direct access to the hayloft at the second floor, and sometimes include granary bins, generally framed in wood with wood plank siding. The upper floor was often in 3 parts. A central loading floor, threshing floor, had large haylofts to either side. The opposite lower side had direct access to the ground, generally with thick stone masonry walls which enclosed pens and stalls for the animals and related rooms, sometimes a small dairy. The Oslands are the direct descendants of Robert Beggs, the first owner from England. Built in the 1870s and restored with a new stone foundation in 1902, the original barn was torn down and a new barn constructed from barn boards offered by their parents. 2 additions were added in the 20s and 60s to house pigs. Now the family farms sheep, chickens, and cattle. The large O represents the pride of ownership of over 4 generations of Oslands and 4 animals that have and still reside there. This is also a bank barn. The U-shaped barn was originally owned by the Noble family who kept cattle. Mr. and Mrs. Stan Gray bought the property in 1920, and their son Bev married Barbara in 1953. Today, she and her son Scott continue to run the farm. The small quilt board is a reinterpretation of the owner's own quilt, which she created in 2007. This is a gambrel roofed barn. Gambrel roofed barn. This is one of the most popular farming methods for barn roofs to increase the interior capacity of the loft. This is achieved by creating 2 slopes, a more shallow upper slope and a steeper side slope, with a top ridge and 2 secondary ridges at the change in slope. Traditionally, heavy timber framing was used for this, or later by trussing the roof framing. The lower barn may be a traditional English or bank barn arrangement. Located on the large barn is a quilt board designed with the flying geese pattern, as these birds are often seen on the 2 ponds on each side of the road. In the past, mute swans resided on these ponds. The Canadian geese colors are represented in the bordered triangles. This is an HTLX barn complex. HXTL plan barns. Often the initial basic barn would be added to for extra capacity adding wings, which changed the plan of the initial barn into an H, X, T, or L plan. Or the barn may have been designed for extra capacity for a specific purpose. Depending on the scale of the farm operation, these barn complexes can be quite large, with specialty functions in various sections of the complex related to the farm operations. Further, depending on when various additions were created, they might reflect English, Dutch, shed, gambrel, or bowstring truss forms. Originally a tobacco farm and later a hog operation, the house and buildings show on the 1878 Illustrated Historical Atlas of Northumberland and Dundas. The Bradys came to Canada from Scotland in 1967 and have been farming in Hope Township for 40 years. This is a gambrel roofed barn, English mix. The original barn was probably built in the late 1800s. Now a newer one sits on the same foundation. The previous owner had prize shorthorns housed in a barn relocated from the Perrytown Church property that could sell for over $100,000. On the south side of the big barn was a huge sign that said Gloria Dale, named after Mr. Phillips' wife Gloria. It was a huge guide mark for travelers. Today, a new signboard shows the pattern depicting the rail fences that would have lined the road up the hill under the blue and cloudy skies. This is a gambrel roofed barn complex. Arthur is the great-grandson of Mark Nelson Gardner, the original owner who purchased the land in 1826. The small barn was built in 1876 and the two larger barns in the 1900s. Represented on the quilt boards are the turnips the gardeners grew with the greens growing out of the hay vent in the top of the barn. This is an L-bank barn. Purchased in 1802 by the Wilcox, the land was sold to the Deans in 1850. The road just to the west is named Deans Hill Road. The barn was built for market gardening, and the materials were all taken from the land: the beams, boards, and stones. The hand-hewed beams show the work of master builders. Even the original equipment for moving hay still sits in the upper floor of the barn. This board was designed by grade 5 and 6 students of North Hope School. This is an English barn. Built in 1961, this is a new barn built on the original foundation. While Winnie was cooking in her kitchen, a neighbor called her to say her barn was on fire. All the neighbors rushed over to help carry the piglets out of the barn. Almost all were saved. This board was designed by the grade 4-5 students of North Hope School. This is also a gambrel roofed barn. Once owned by the Howe family, still living on the north side of the road, the barns were shelter for beef cattle. The Little Red Barn was probably a drive shed, a handy location at the intersection of County Road 10 and 9th Line. The quilt board depicts the crossroads pattern with the colors chosen for the proliferation of streams, creeks, ponds, and pastures in the area. This is a small English barn. This property was given to Thomas Campbell in 1827. Generations of Campbells have resided in the area and still do. Part of the original 600 acres include the grist mill, the big dairy barn across the road, and an electrical power plant on Mill Race. The two circles on the quilt board depict the grindstones and gears present in every mill, while the muted primary colors and contemporary design reference the energetic, enterprising endeavors of the original Campbells. This is an English barn. Campbellcroft was settled by the Campbells from Scotland in the 1800s. The original barn was hit by lightning in the 1930s, and another barn from nearby was moved to this foundation. The present barn is used for storage, livestock, and hay. The quilt board lightning rod is surrounded by black and white representing the electric charge in the air, and the red references the big equipment used on the property. This is also a gambrel roofed barn. Originally owned by the Campbells, the present owners now have cattle, sheep, a donkey, and a workhorse sharing the space in the old barn. Keeping with tradition, new barns have recently been built from recycled barn materials. The swallow in the path quilt pattern depicts the blue and rusty feathered swallows that nest nearby. This is a gambrel roof barn complex. This barn was built in circa 1880 and originally included a pig pen, stock barn, and main barn built in a U-shape. Bear tracks in the corner of the quilt board refer to the frequent visits of a bear, while the center motif celebrates a wedding and restoration work that took place in preparation for the soon-to-be newlyweds. This is an English barn. The land was given to Jonathan Bedford in 1812 and soon after sold to James Hawkins for 100 British pounds. Originally, the family had a mixed farm operation with pigs, dairy, hay, corn, chicken, and horses. The building is now home to a Boer goat, a horse, and chickens. Apples are still grown on the property as represented by the tree quilt pattern. This is a shed roof barn. Shed roof barn. A small barn with a single slope shed roof suitable for various uses, such as a stable, a piggery, or a drive shed for implements. These may be single-story or two-story with accommodations for animals below and a small hayloft or mow above. Their size is limited by the span of the single-span roof rafters. The original owner was Charles Trick Corelli, part of the family that founded the Royal Ontario Museum. This bank barn was first built in 1917 and added to in 1927 for cattle. Now used for an equestrian operation, the quilt board shows a diamond paddock surrounding the horse, while the star represents the hero in North Hero Farm. Painted in each corner of the quilt board are the stalls where the owner keeps the horses that she breeds, trains, and boards. This is an English barn. Built in 1860 and purchased in 1919 by the Kellogg family, this barn used to house cattle and horses. Following the 1975 renovations, upgrades and additions have taken place, creating an attractive L enclosure that is home to dairy cattle. Holsteins and the reference to cream are prominent on this quilt board. This is a bowstring arch barn. Bowstring truss roofed barn. This roof design creates a curved arch at either side slope of the main barn roof. Similar to the gambrel barn, its intent is to maximize the capacity of the curved loft with a strong, simple form. The curving form is created through the use of a bowstring truss design, generally of light framing, developed in the 20th century. Holsteins were the tradition on the Macomb farm from the 1800s until 2000. The churn dash quilt pattern and butter-colored background allude to the dairy industry, while the trophy for wheat noted in the center was won at the Royal Winter Fair. The farm is still in operation with cash crops. This is a bank barn. Bill Waddell, the previous owner, was a contractor whose specialty was moving buildings, and like the weather vane, were located north, south, east, or west. The present owner is known for her natural gardens and watercolors represented by the flower-like motif and paintbrush, in addition to the contractor's tools, within the weather vane quilt pattern. This is a converted bank barn. The original 1846 coachman's house was built over the stables, but in the 1920s, a fire destroyed all but the foundation. It was replaced by a low-profile metal storage top, and in the 1950s and 60s, the foundation was leased out for restoration and storage of antique cars. In the 1800s, an antique dealer built the current board and batten barn as his warehouse. Windows were installed in 2014 so the space could be used for home offices, a fine example of adaptive reuse. The quilt pattern reflects the pride of Canadian heritage in the maple leaf, and the saw blade pattern depicts the harvesting of the 120 pine trees originally on the property, giving the name Pinehurst to the home. This is a converted English barn. Catherine McComb. As a watercolor artist and a quilt enthusiast with an interest in landscape, botanicals, patterns, and history, this project was a perfect match. Catherine lives next door to her grandmother's garden in Welcome, and it's there where she creates. Catherine has 2 shows a year. Lois Richardson. Lois is a graduate of the Ontario College of Art and Design and was a set designer and painter for the Cameco Capitol Theatre, Port Hope Festival Theatre for 15 years. Currently, she is working with other theatre production companies in Ontario and is also a muralist and designer for private clients. Pamela Tate. Pamela is an award-winning professional fine artist specializing in painting and is now also exploring printmaking. Her art can be found in England, Mexico, Switzerland, and the US, as well as across Canada. She is the owner and curator of the Tate Gallery in Canton. Moya McPhail. Moya is a professional interior designer specializing in space design, kitchen and bathroom renovations, and color consultations. She enjoys gardening, painting, and sculpture. Moya, along with Catherine, led the collaboration design of Quilt 11 and North Hope Central School grades 5 and 6. Moya also incorporated several designs presented by the grade 4-5 students for Quilt 12.